So, hello everyone. This is EUROSTUDENT Talks. Greetings
Hello.
from the EUROSTUDENT team. My name is Marlene, and I will be hosting this event here today. I am sure that you will be enjoying this webinar. It will be a very intriguing topic. We will look into the topic of student mobility. We will be doing that in Finnish context, but the cherry on top today is that this webinar is a wonderful example of how to use the interplay between EUROSTUDENT data and national statistics, and what we can see then if we do that. I'm absolutely happy to welcome here our speaker, Juhani Saari. Hello, Juhani.
Thank you very much for having me, Marlene.
Juhani works as a statistician in the survey unit of Statistics Finland, working on various household and business surveys. He has also worked with educational statistics and research on socioeconomic differences in access into higher education. And I think that I won't make my intro any longer. I have had a sneak preview to Juhani's slides, and I know that there is a lot to talk about, many interesting findings to see. So please, Juhani, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone is receiving. So thank you for the kind introduction. As you said, I've been working with the national data collection of EUROSTUDENT at Statistics Finland since EUROSTUDENT 7, and prior to that I also have some experience in first-hand research use of the national data sets from EUROSTUDENT 6 and 5. But with that brief introduction in mind, here's the outline for today's presentation. Before proceeding any further, I would like to apologize the heavy use of regression analysis and related multivariate methods in my presentation. I know among you participants, there might be someone not that familiar with the use of multivariate methods, but the way I see it is that international mobility of students is determined by a number of factors that affect each student's individual decisions simultaneously, and in order to get a better grasp on the decision-making process, you have to take into account that many factors are influencing these decisions simultaneously, and that's why just looking at simple cross tabulations and one-way frequencies of EUROSTUDENT variables related to mobility is not going to get us very far. And also, since I know that that's primary method of presenting EUROSTUDENT results, I decided that for this talks webinar, I was going to try out something different. Now, we're going to be looking at the mobility of Finnish higher education students in the EUROSTUDENT national data sets, as well as our national educational statistical databases. Finland is one of the countries that provide an open access statistical database to monitor the mobility, among other things, in higher education in a yearly basis. One can, much like in the EUROSTUDENT indicator dataset, one can define subsets of students by field of study or institute of higher education or age group or gender, etc., and see who is going abroad during their studies and who is not. And beginning with a brief outline of what the mobility figures in Finland look like, I'm carefully proceeding to trying to come up with the determinants based on prior research and the EUROSTUDENT national datasets, that what are the main predictors of mobility that decision makers and researchers might want to focus their attention to, assuming that one of the policy goals that we're sharing is that we want to increase the mobility of students, especially in those groups that are currently underrepresented in mobility statistics. A few words about our national EUROSTUDENT sample. So I would like to just emphasize that we give much weight to the fact that much of the interesting thing that's happening within higher education is a variation in fields of study, because what you're studying is one of the key determinants of your student experience, not only in the contents of your education, but also your educational origins and possible implications for decision making on whether you want to go abroad during your studies or not. Because if not for the utility of the mobility period abroad, that of course varies by field of study and by what other factors. And our EUROSTUDENT national sample consists of around 26,000 students, out of which a little more than 1/4 responded to the survey. And we conduct a stratification by track of education. Now, Finland follows a dual structure of higher education. So we have two types of higher education institutions. We want to make sure that our national data set has a sufficient number of respondents by field of study and by track of education. So from both sectors of higher education, we should have at least 200 valid responses from each of the ISKED 10 fields of education. That's one of the goals of our sampling design. And it's also benefiting what I'm going to present you today, because if we were to conduct the National EUROSTUDENT with just a simple random sampling design, we would not be able to do any statistical inferences about students studying smaller fields of study like humanities in the polytechnics, for just to give an example. I already mentioned briefly about the structure of higher education in Finland. Here are also some figures about the yearly number of outgoing students according to our national statistics. The numbers presented on this slide refer to statistical year of 2019 for obvious reasons, because that was the last year we experienced a more or less normal year for mobility. So the total number of outgoing students for any stay abroad during their studies on a yearly basis is around 5,000 for both sectors of higher education, now referring to university and University of Applied Sciences sectors here. So, but they're of equal size in terms of actual number of students. Now, one of the key differences between the structure of the degrees themselves, I'm not going to go very deep into that, but it's important to notice that the University of Applied Sciences in Finland mainly offer bachelor degree education. One can proceed to master's level degrees, but in between bachelor and master's, one has to have at least 2 or 3 years of work experience relevant to one's own field. So international mobility of master's level University of Applied Sciences degrees, it's not completely non-existent, but it's quite rare. And I'm not going to focus on that aspect of mobility much in the presentation. I'm really focused on the attentions of students in their freshman or second year of higher education. And another important difference between the two sectors and their mobility patterns is that the students in University of Applied Sciences education, they tend to do a lot more internships abroad, whereas university students are studying a certain number of months within a foreign university and not so much doing internships. Of course, some of them are. Now, here are some figures on the yearly number of mobility periods per track of higher education. As you can see, even prior to the COVID outbreak, we witnessed a slight spiraling trend downward. So our educational policymakers have been worrying about not being able to attract as many students to go abroad as would be preferable. So there has been a downward trend over the years, even prior to COVID, and it's interesting to see what the recovery of student mobility is going to look like once the current statistical year reaches its end. Now, this is the first result of this round's EUROSTUDENT data. This is not yet published, as our national results and also the indicator database results are not yet published, but I'm going to show you nonetheless that I'm here comparing the mobility intentions of university and UAS students studying in their first and second year of higher education. On the top right, you can see the latest results and also EUROSTUDENT 7 results. So as you can see, the COVID pandemic has had an apparent effect on our mobility intentions of our higher education students, bearing in mind that the data collection took place early in 2022 when the pandemic was still outgoing. So there was a lot of uncertainty among students whether or not mobility as we know it is going to be possible during the coming year. So that's also one of the things that one has to keep in mind here. Now, what's a bit puzzling is that, as I told you previously, University of Applied Science students, they, according to national statistics, they do a lot more outgoing student mobility periods on a yearly basis, although they don't tend to report them as intended, as intentions in the EUROSTUDENT dataset. One of the explanations might be that they simply do not perceive the international internship, which is one of the focuses of University of Applied Sciences mobility, that they simply don't report it as the EUROSTUDENT questionnaire is intended. Although perhaps a more plausible explanation about this is that since the degree programs themselves are substantially shorter, it might be that those UAS students who are intending to go abroad already are during the second year of their studies, which is then not captured by the EUROSTUDENT dataset. So it might be that this subset of students is not completely representative in this respect. So this is one of the reasons why I'm going to focus some of my attention in the upcoming slides to the mobility experiences of university students. These are then the figures of mobility by fields of study and track of higher education. On the left, you can see on the orange bars the total number of students studying either a bachelor or master's level degree in each respective field. And on the blue, you can see the number of outgoing students on a yearly basis. And the dotted line is then their relative proportion, how many outgoing mobility periods do we observe per 10,000 students is on the right-hand axis. And as you can see, the variance between fields of study is quite substantial. If you just look at the sheer volumes proportional to the number of students, we witness that that the social sciences, business, law, and administration field are 2 or 3-fold more internationally mobile as compared to the STEM fields in the university sector. The same pattern can be observed somewhat within the University of Applied Sciences sector, but over there, one of the key differences is that the students within this sector of higher education tend to concentrate on the big 3 subject fields, so business and law, engineering, and health and welfare degrees. So there's, in relative terms, much mobility in certain fields of University of Applied Sciences degrees, but the variation between the fields is somewhat lower than for the university degrees. And this is all based on national statistics. This is not EUROSTUDENT. This is what our educational statistical database covers each year. But we're gonna make a note of this because the sheer number in relative mobility by field of study is very great in Finland. Now let's take another look at what the mobility of students looks like in our national statistics. And for the reasons previously mentioned, I'm going to focus on the mobility patterns of university students, and just to have a look like what the interruption in mobility caused by the COVID pandemic looks like when we take a look at the mobility statistics. So going back in time to 2016, when everything was fine, I'm here presenting the mobility pattern of students who first enrolled into higher education in that year in the university sector. As you can see, some students have already managed to go abroad during their first years of study, but that's more of an exception than a rule. What's happening here in the presentation is that we are moving forward in time year by year, and we see a new cohort of students enrolling in their degree programs, and then we observe the number of outgoing students per year of enrollment progressing as time goes on. So here on the orange bar, you can see that the freshmen of 2016 have already had quite a few mobility periods during their second year of study. 2018, okay, these are the axes, I forgot. I added these just to make things more readable. So 2018, we see that actually the bulk of mobility comes during the third year of studies for university students. And now we can compare the freshmen of 2017 to freshmen of 2016 and see that there's no notable difference in the mobility pattern of these cohorts. Moving to 2017 and 19, we can see that still quite a few students doing their university bachelor master's degree are going abroad during their fourth year of study. And as you can see, the 2017 is catching up 2016 cohort quite well. Then the pandemic hits. This is the net effect of unrealized student mobility that can be witnessed in our statistics. Comparing the blue bars of 2018 to 2016 and 70s, we can see that more than half of outgoing mobility disappeared as a result of the COVID pandemic. And 2021 shows the same pattern. All outgoing mobility halted. But now what's interesting is that we have arrived the present date, the date of when the data collection of our Finnish EUROSTUDENT sample took place. And we have a representative sample of the intention of students to study abroad that were collected at the final stages of the pandemic. What we can do with the data, together with these bars that are derived from our national educational statistics, is that we can extrapolate by using the population weights in our data set to predict that these are the students' aspirations for going abroad. We're going to use the category, I have already made some preparations for going abroad, because that's one of the key variables of interest in the EUROSTUDENT sample for when studying outgoing student mobility. Extrapolating by using the population weights in our data set, and assuming that everyone who has already made preparations are also gonna study abroad. These are the estimates that we are expecting to see in our national student outgoing mobility statistics within the couple years from now. We're eagerly waiting for the end of this statistical year so that we can see and perhaps even validate these results, because bear in mind that these are estimates derived from our national data set, and there's of course statistical uncertainty within them, even though the number of respondents is quite high, so they should in that respect be quite accurate. And also then there's the second category of interest in the EUROSTUDENT data set. We have the students who have intentions but have thus far made no preparations for studying abroad. I'm just gonna make an assumption that perhaps 50% of these intentions are eventually gonna materialize as outgoing student mobility, because it's not realistic to assume that everyone is who just say that they have some aspirations for studying abroad, that they're gonna do so. So this is what the extrapolation from EUROSTUDENT datasets looks like. This is what we are expecting the recovery from the COVID pandemic to look like. So not completely reaching the levels of mobility prior to COVID, but a recovery nonetheless. Will be quite interesting to see what the future holds for national mobility. Now moving on to a completely different topic. Now, this is the topic of the presentation, trying to identify key determinants of student mobility in the EUROSTUDENT dataset. I'm not going to present a complete research overview over the topic because much research have been published about possible causes and determinants of EUROSTUDENT dataset, but here are some key findings that keep repeating in the research literature, which also give us quite useful research hypotheses that we can test out using the EUROSTUDENT dataset. So first of all, we have the student socioeconomic background. Research suggests that students with parents from higher educational background are more likely to study abroad, perhaps because of the cultural capital or economic resources that their parents are providing them. And also these are research published in this is not concerning just Finland, but mobility in general. And then we have research findings suggesting various mechanisms on how the field of study might be affecting the student's decision to go abroad. These Jokila and Kallo was published using the EUROSTUDENT 6 data set here in Finland. Worth reading if you're interested in utilizing the EUROSTUDENT data set. Although published in Finnish, the abstract is in English. Then we have factors related to educational opportunities in one's home country. So it might be that if a student is unsatisfied with a certain aspect of their degree program, they might be interested in complementing their curriculum palette with what the university in another country might be offering. And then we, of course, have the factors related to student life situation and macroeconomics, like job opportunities, financial means, family situation, etc. These are actually the main predictors that EUROSTUDENT is, in my opinion, interested in, because the EUROSTUDENT data makes a lot of effort in trying to distinguish specific life situations that might make certain aspects of higher education more accessible or less so. And then we have research suggesting that it's the social skills and networks. Students from mingling with like-minded individuals during their curricula might be more inclined to study abroad than students who feel isolated and lack social skills requisite for like making friends abroad. Now let's see what these factors look like in the EUROSTUDENT dataset. So the empirical analysis I'm going to present you follows the logic of fitting a logistical regression model in the outcome variable discussed before. So whether or not a student has any intentions for student mobility during their current degree program. I'm omitting from the analysis all the students who, by the time of data collection, have already reported an outgoing mobility period, because I'm only interested in the intention and potential of students who have not yet decided to go abroad. And also I'm limiting the focus to students in their freshman and second year of study, because as we're approaching the final stages of studies, it simply becomes less and less feasible to still go abroad during their studies because of apparent reasons. So the greatest potential can be found, I would argue, by studying the intentions of students in their beginning stages of their studies. Now, in the EUROSTUDENT questionnaire, we can find some useful measures, sometimes so-called proxy variables, for many of these suggested determinants discussed in the previous literature, in identifying the student life circumstances that are unrelated to possible motivation, such as family status, financial resources, working alongside studies, those kind of factors. And then we have parental background, we have the financial status, the subjective measure of students, as well as the educational attainment of higher education students' parents. And then we have another number of interesting factors that are associated with one's field of study. We have the measure of the perceived quality of current degree program, here testing the hypothesis that perhaps students who are less satisfied with their current degree program might be more inclined to go abroad. Then we have the the perception of international labor market quality of one's degree, as well as the perceived utility of studying abroad. This is one of the measures from the obstacles to international mobility in the questionnaire. It's actually somewhat tricky to perceive that. Yeah, it measures the extent to which a student assumes a certain factor is an obstacle mobility rather than a positive, like a pull factor to international mobility. And then for social networks, we use the measure for knowing other students in my field of study as a proxy. And all of the regressions that I've run are taking into account the complex sampling structure of our EUROSTUDENT dataset. This means the stratification and the oversampling of students within certain fields of study. And one of the questions that might arise at this point, I mean, this is a complicated topic, but there's a reason why I'm not just simply running a regression using the aforementioned perceived obstacles to mobility as predictors, because the EUROSTUDENT questionnaire, I mean, first of all, this is a cross-sectional survey, and we're asking about the students' intentions for studying abroad, after which we ask them about the perceived obstacles to higher education. In terms of causal inference, it's always problematic that you ask motivations for doing certain things after the target variable is proposed in the questionnaire. So this implies that the students who are reporting that they have some intentions of studying abroad might be justifying their previous answer in the motivational factors that are asked afterwards. I'm not saying that this is not a valid measure, but just in terms of causal inferences, you might be observing dual causality. So not that motivation leads to action, but also action might be leading to motivation. So that's the reason why I'm refraining from doing this. And the way to visualize this is that when we have our target variable as the mobility intention of students, and then a factor of interest might be, well, family and childcare being perceived as an obstacle to studies. But the causal relationship between the measures in a cross-sectional study might be as follows, as I mentioned, that it would be the perception of family and children as obstacle might being affected causally, I mean, both ways, but particularly the latter one is more problematic, that the intention might be causing the students to answer the survey in a particular manner. Okay, this is a complicated topic, but this is just in case some of you might be wondering why I'm not just using the mobility, motivation or obstacles questions as predictors. But the way I argue is that if a student has a family, then having a family might be intending mobility intentions, but not the other way around. No one gets a family because they say in a questionnaire that I'm going to study abroad. But enough of that. Proceeding to the actual research findings. Now, the first initial model that I'm fitting into the data with the aforementioned omission of certain groups of students predicts the following. These are the predictors related to students' current life situation. And the model predicts that first of all, mobility intentions are very strongly associated with students' age group. This is not surprising. Students in their early 20s are most likely to respond that they are contemplating on mobility periods abroad. One of the reasons might be that, of course, the life situation drastically changes between the early 20s and late 20s, and as people get jobs and family and take mortgages and stuff. But the model also suggests that financial difficulties experienced during their studies. Now, this is actually an interesting one. One might assume that it's actually the most well-off students who should have the best or the best circumstances for going abroad. But actually, oh, sorry, this is a forced update that just popped up in my computer. I'm not sure if you can see this. Did my presentation slide just disappear?
We can't see at the moment.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, this is a government laptop, and a forced update just popped up. They never ask what if you have the right time of calling them. So I'm just reopening my presentation and moving on. Sorry for the confusion.
Yeah, but we can now see it again nicely.
Yeah, I'm gonna give an angry feedback on someone. Don't know just whom yet, but all right then. The model suggests that students who are experiencing only somewhat financial difficulties are actually the most likely ones to contemplate international mobility. It's interesting that students who observe great difficulties or no difficulties are actually similarly likely to contemplate mobility, whereas the sweet spot seems to be in the middle ground. One of the explanations might be that these are the students who have a flexible financial situation. If you experience no difficulties whatsoever financial wise, it might be due to you already being employed in such a high wage or position that you simply don't want to lose your job opportunity. That's one of the explanations that might be affecting here. But moving on to family background, we also then observed that the suggested result that the students from lower educational background with non-tertiary education backgrounds are less likely to contemplate mobility than those with higher education backgrounds. And also then we find that students who don't have children and are not living with their parents or with a partner are more likely to contemplate going abroad. So these are the life situation factors. And now moving on with a regression model table like this would be somewhat confusing. So I'm moving on from the traditional tabulation of odds ratios and their statistical differences approach to a table-like format that's, I hope, will be more pleasant to follow. This is the table of the life situation factors for which we found statistically significant associations with the contemplation of mobility. So these are the same results, but just in a different format. Now, one of the ways in which we can then make statistical inferences between, statistically speaking, is that we can then include new factors in the model and see what happens to the explanatory power of each individual factor when new explanatory independent variables are included in the model. So in this stage, I'm including the factors that are depicting the current degree program that the student is studying. We have the expected duration of studies in years. This is one of the questions that we asked in our national questionnaire. This is not part of the standard EUROSTUDENT questionnaire, but one of the hypotheses that I wanted to test out was that whether the students who are going to study 6 years are more likely to contemplate mobility than the students who are only interested in studying a 3-year bachelor's degree. But no such association was observed. And then we have the satisfaction to one's current degree program. We also did not observe any statistically significant associations, neither with knowing a lot of fellow students. This is testing out the social networking hypothesis. But then the fourth factor, the perceived utility of a current degree program in the international labor market is a fairly strong predictor. So here the findings suggest that students studying in fields which they believe are going to facilitate their job seeking in the international labor market, should they choose to do so, also perceive the more utility in international mobility than for other students. So this factor is a clear go for the next round. And then we include one of the key motivational measures in the EUROSTUDENT dataset to the model, the perceived lack of benefits to one's current studies, because this is actually quite interesting. As I presented before, we observe quite drastic differences between the relative mobility by field of study and by track of higher education. This, I would argue, is the primary measure in the EUROSTUDENT dataset that might be able to capture the core reasons behind this variance. So including this independent in the model increases the explanatory power of the model quite drastically, even to an extent that when we then include fields of study per se, as well as track of higher education and their interaction, remembering that students studying in fields of business in the UAS track might perceive the benefits quite differently from students of economics in the university sector. But no, we actually don't observe a statistically significant association, even though our mobility statistics seem to be proving otherwise. There are drastic differences between fields of study, but the model suggests that we should focus on the perceived utility factor as a determinant of mobility intentions. This is just a simple figure illustrating the differences between fields of study according to the latest EUROSTUDENT data. This is the number of students who perceive the lack of benefits to one's current degree program as a major obstacle in their mobility. And as you can see, there are differences, but not that big as the statistics might lead you to think so. Students in the fields of education and welfare are much more likely to perceive the lack of benefit as a major obstacle than students in social science, business, and law. But this is just the EUROSTUDENT estimate. What will happen if we plot the two measures together in the same graph? The perceived utility as measured by EUROSTUDENT and the relative number of outgoing student mobility from our national educational statistics. You end up in a plot line like this. So on the x-axis, you can find the field of study specific estimate for the number of students perceiving the lack of benefit for their current studies as a major obstacle. And on the y-axis, you can see the average mobility, the relative one, between years 2018 and 2022. And fitting a regression line there is quite good evidence in my opinion that this is a very valid measure that has predictive power outside the scope of the EUROSTUDENT survey itself. Remember, this is the y-axis figures are derived from statistical sources that are independent from the EUROSTUDENT data collection. Of course, we could plot the motivation with the self-reported observed mobility intention, but this is more valid because this figure depicts the long-term average of mobility by fields of study, and in my opinion, speaks for the validity of this measure that one should be interested in the perceived benefits as an obstacle to mobility, which then further leads us to continue our analysis in trying to explain the differences between different fields of study for this measure. So it begs the question, now what are the determinants by fields of study that vary across the higher education's experience for students that also are able to predict the perceived benefit factor? This is actually the final regression model, so bear with me. This is not going to go any very much longer. But I'm going to test a number of hypotheses for this measure. Whether or not the perceived international labor market value of current degree is actually a solid predictor for the experienced utility, and whether or not the year of study as the study progresses are the experiences of freshmen different from students of fourth or fifth years in their master's degree program, any different? And then some subjective skills and abilities measures also included in the part as well. So language proficiency of students might be associated with the perceived benefit, as well as the prior mentioned socioeconomic background of students. And this is a simple OLS regression. The five, as I simply plot the 5-point Likert scale measure of perceived benefits to or lack thereof for one's studies as the dependent variable, and including then the measures of characteristics of one's current degree program as independence. And what we find here is that indeed the perceived international labor market value of current degree program, as well as students' language proficiency and year of study, are key predictors in the perceived benefits measure, including field of education and track of education actually do not significantly increase the explanatory power of the model, leading me to believe that it's actually, among other things, these factors within fields of study and thus explaining the variance between them that's actually worth focusing your attention to. As we saw previously, the differences in observed mobility by fields of study were quite drastic, but if you model the motivation, this specific aspect of motivation by using just these measures that characterize your current degree program, you end up with a lot more information on what's actually going on within the student's head. So to conclude, mobility varies across fields of study, especially among university students. And the perception of utility to one's study is the strongest individual predictor in student mobility, even when taking into account the various life circumstances that's also contributing in this individual student decision-making. So I would argue, based on these results, that any effective policy measures or interventions that want to increase student mobility in such circumstances might want to emphasize the benefits of mobility to students, especially in those fields of studies that are currently the most underrepresented in the mobility, so ICT, engineering, education, and health here in Finland. Also, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the financial means of students are indeed hampering international student mobility. My results seem to suggest otherwise, that there actually seems to be a sweet spot in the income or financial means curve, that actually the middle ground gives the students the most flexibility in pursuing their international study experience aspirations. And also, I did not report this, but I also tested whether parental wealth status was able to predict anything in our model. It was not. So educational background was not actually found that significant. So not the means of yourself nor those of your parents were really significant in predicting the Finnish student mobility. So suggesting that decision makers might want to focus the attention somewhat away from the financial situation, even though this is one of the factors that our national student unions and many other interest groups are arguing that is actually the main factor. But according to EUROSTUDENT data, it's actually not that big of a deal. And then the final key findings is that every single regression model that I presented took into account the fact that the students within fields of study vary a lot in their socio-demographic composition and status. And even though when we held all these factors constant, we were able to observe interesting variation between fields of study. But nonetheless, the key socio-demographic predictors like family status and age, they persisted across all the models that we looked into. And since the socio-demographic composition of students by fields of study vary quite a lot, most of the students in the health and social sector in the UAS educational track, they are women in their late 20s, early 30s with families, whereas the STEM and ICT students in the university sector, they are the youngest and have least family ties out of all student groups. Leads us to conclude that this is the place where the biggest potential in increasing our national mobility figures is the greatest. So any interventions in trying to reassess the perceived benefits of mobility might want to focus their attention on students in those fields. And last but not least, what I presented you today must be at first glance somewhat confusing. Well, this is because the task of trying to establish causal deterministic statistical relationship between motivations and various push and pull factors of student mobility, it's not an easy task. And what I presented you today is certainly not the most elegant and not the best and not the most comparable across different countries. But still, I would argue that this is probably the way that EuroStudent, or the utilization, the international research utilization of EuroStudent should be perhaps focused in the near future, because it's these differences between key explanatory factors that vary across countries that are actually the most interesting ones. It might be that the results that I found using the Finnish data set concerning student financial situations are not replicable in other countries, because of course the financial status of students varies greatly within the participant countries of the EuroStudent. So it might be that we do not observe this type of association in, like, for instance, the Nordic countries, but could be that we observe it somewhere else. And only by comparing regression estimates in a format somewhat like what I just presented you is the key to make this kind of inferences. And perhaps some research agency, perhaps the good folks at the DCWH, might be the ones to suggest such an approach, perhaps not for this round, but perhaps in the future, that we might want to test out a multi-level, multivariate approach for explaining some key EuroStudent phenomena, out of which the international mobility certainly is among the most interesting one, not in terms of research, but also policy-wise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juhani. It was a really great presentation. Any questions, comments from our audience? I won't steal the time myself. Just raise your hand or interrupt, and we are eager to hear your views and questions, of course, as well.
And also, I would like to certainly hear if any of the other national teams, I actually know that some of you have been contemplating similar approach. Have you been arriving at similar conclusions or anything? But there seems to be a question.
Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Eva from Estonia, and I would also like to say a huge thank you for the very interesting and concise presentation. I think it's really impressive that you have been able to combine the state registry data with EuroStudent data, and this way, using this complex methods and approach, you really achieved some very interesting results. And in terms of messages, as you already said, it would be very interesting to see what the international comparison in EuroStudent will show in terms of mobility. But I think, I don't know if you agree that one of the policy key messages for takeaway is that if you show students in various fields already at an early stage of their studies the importance or how the international mobility could benefit their position in international labor market and probably also in domestic labor market, coupled with enhancing their language skills, then it potentially could increase the mobility rate and maybe incentivize students to overcome some of the obstacles that they perceive. And my question as well, and maybe remark with it, is about this parental and own financial means having not significant effect on mobility. Perhaps it is due to that these options have become so flexible and yeah, basically the conditions for mobility do not require huge financial contributions, and they're very well supported. Or what's your take on it? And thank you.
Exactly, thank you very much for the question. Exactly as you put it, the result suggests that indeed the current status of various means of financing your mobility abroad seem to be sufficient because otherwise you would be observing much greater differences between students from various socio-economic backgrounds. But this is not to say that the situation, if it's perfect now, it couldn't be changing, because what we're experiencing right now across Europe, of course, with the soaring inflation and economic uncertainty, it might be that the same results would not be found had they been conducted with the coming EUROSTUDent within a few years.
Yes, thank you, Johan, for answering, and also thanks to Eva for asking. We also had a comment from Yasin in the chat that if you're doing further research, here would be Yasin's suggestion that your point on obstacles to international mobility. However, what could be done with this one indicator that you mentioned, that why didn't you use that, this V511, is a descriptive analysis, which student groups are close or away to which justifications, obstacles, and regarding the wider implications, you could order the data from EUROSTUDent and do the comparison yourself. So it was a kind of suggestion and comment from Yasin.
Yeah, that's very true, but also this is the type of reporting that's already being done with the soon-to-be published indicator database. I really saw no reasoning replicating something that's going to be published anyway. I was merely suggesting an entirely new approach.
Yeah, indeed. It was really, really interesting look into your approach of doing that.
But yeah, but I would still like to emphasize that I'm not a scholar in the topic, nor in the theoretical or in the empirical sense. I'm suggesting that perhaps someone with a little more profound theoretical knowing of the topic might be the one who defines the regression model that many countries could then try to replicate and then compare the results, because what EUROSTUDent does so wonderfully is to standardize and harmonize the various life situation circumstances in a data set that's ready to be used in such a way.
Indeed. It's like pluses and minuses always in life, that it would be maybe good to have the background in the field, but on the other hand, without that, you can have a very fresh and different perspective and angle to look at that. Any other questions, comments? Either you are a policymaker or a researcher. What did you hear for you? Maybe it sparked some interest, inspired you. You can comment. Any thoughts that came to your mind, or also questions to Johanni, of course, are welcome. Until our audience is thinking, I actually was wondering that, are there any other... Okay, Helga has a question. Yes, please, Helga.
Thank you. I didn't want to interrupt you. If you want to ask your question first.
No, go your first.
Okay. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm Helga Posset from Austria, from the ministry, so a policymaker. you said that raising the potential for mobility, you would see the most potential in young STEM students, whereas you see female students in health and welfare, they're a bit older and they have a family already, so there's no potential. What would you recommend the policymakers to do? Because I find it a bit problematic when we just want to raise mobility potential for certain student groups or certain student groups in that case.
Yes, of course. I'm just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that you omit any of these student groups, aforementioned ones, from any policy-making interventions. But what the empirical analysis shows is that the greatest potential is found among these students who studied STEM fields, partially because the lack of constraints in their current life situations are not hindering mobility. So if you just want to maximize the output, which is to increase the number of mobile students, then you should focus your attention in these groups. But if you want to level the playing field and just want to promote the equal access to mobility, then of course the implications are just as you described, completely different. I mean, that these are two different approaches: more bang for the buck or to maximize equality. Those are not completely incompatible goals, but in this framework, I just present it not so. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the audience? Actually, my question that I started to ask before was that are there any other topics besides student mobility that you have looked into so that you have combined Eurostudent data and national statistics? Or if not, maybe you have some ideas for the future what those topics could be.
Oh, and I mean, I just want to be clear before answering that. I'm not exactly combining the register information on an individual level in the data set. I'm just analyzing them in a comparable manner, because what Eurostudent does is trying to explain a number of phenomena within the higher education that are also covered by an external statistical data source. But yes, a very good question. I guess mobility is like the prime case for Eurostudent, because Eurostudent questionnaire is built upon on the theme of mobility in such a way that it provides a number of useful predictors and focus groups for conducting such an analysis. But yeah, similar analyses for completely different outcome variables could be found across the Eurostudent questionnaire. Perhaps the digitalization of higher education or the discrimination experiences might be equally interesting to cover in such a manner.
Yeah, so perhaps inspiration for you yourself or others that in the future we can hear at Eurostudent Talks about these topics as well. But I think I will wrap it up when looking at the clock. If we don't have any other questions or comments, but if we do, then please, this is the last chance. Anyway, seems that not. So once again, huge thanks to you, Juhani. It was really, really nice looking into what you have been researching and what are your findings. Of course, thanks to all our listeners. It was a pleasure to be with you here. And regarding the next Eurostudent Talks, the topic will still be confirmed, but you can save the date, I think the 19th of October, or at least around 90-ish of October. And of course, we will let you know via Twitter, via email list, and so on. So see you next time, next month. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Juhani.